Hello everyone, welcome back to another one of our Through the Bible studies. Today we're going to be summarizing the book of Ecclesiastes. Now Ecclesiastes is the second to last of the poetic section of the Old Testament, and this will be the second part of three that ultimately makes up what the Old Testament is: history, poetry, and prophecy. And this poetic section of Scripture was written by King Solomon at the end of his life, providing us a perspective that ultimately reflects on the nature of life. And after Solomon had seen it all, done it all, and gotten the t-shirts, he reflected on his collection and ultimately could only summarize it as a man from the 9th century BC could, as vanity, as grasping for the wind. It's ultimately a pointless and fruitless, just an empty endeavor. It just passes through your fingers. It's pointless. That's the point of this book, is that life essentially, no matter what you experience, it won't satisfy, it won't give you meaning. And he gives 7 examples of ultimately what his attempts to satisfy his life in the things in this life were and how they disappointed him. So buckle your seatbelts, because this is going to get depressing. But understand as well, the reason why it's in our Bibles is for a very important reason. It's not to say that these things aren't worth doing. It's because we make them what we're living for is the problem. When we confuse the purpose for our existence with what we do in our existence, then ultimately we're just going to get our terms confused, and we'll discuss what that means in a moment. He starts off with talking about accomplishments and achievements, and as a world leader of the nation of Israel, which was the world ruling empire at this time, he had more to brag than most world leaders could. He brought peace to the Middle East. He built one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. He accumulated more wealth, more status. He made silver as common as rocks in the nation of Israel. And if you've been to the nation of Israel, you know there's a lot of rocks. But among all these things, no matter what he would have accomplished, even his contribution to the scholarly world, he wrote down things about botany and zoology and basically just observations of nature that we're only revisiting and revising to our current day. And this was 3,000 years in the past. Solomon had accomplished a lot. He was the most famous world leader in the ancient world. But you know what he came to the conclusion to? If you were to ask him personally that everything he had seen, said, and done, what did it amount to? Well, he would have said, anything and everything you do or say has been done before and will be done again, except they'll be the ones to take credit for it, because they'll do it better. Okay, well, what about something a little bit more personal than accomplishment? What about wisdom? And if you remember in the book of Proverbs, we discussed wisdom is different from knowledge. It's not what you know, but what you do with what you know, however much or little that is. And the ability to make good decisions. Solomon also said that's pointless. No matter how many lessons we learn, we always seem to make the same mistakes, even and especially when we know better. How did Solomon know this? Well, Solomon was unique as far as historical individuals were concerned, in that his wisdom, his ability to make good decisions with what he knew, actually came from a divine source. He was given more wisdom than any other man in history, second only to the source himself. And you know what it ultimately amounted to? He was called by God to be king of the nation of Israel. He had the ideal upbringing in a man who was called a man after God's own heart, the most exemplary relationship than any other person in the nation of Israel's history had ever known, an ideal upbringing under King David. And finally, he lived during a time of peace, one that he achieved, granted, but understand, no wars, no conflict, ideal environment to make the right decisions, ideal upbringing to know the right decisions, and an ideal source of that knowledge that no one else could even hope to boast. And ultimately, what did it amount to? Solomon repeated that same famous saying, passion trumps logic. Here's an example of this. He had to write out, as every king of Israel would, according to Deuteronomy 17, when you have a king, he's to write his own copy of the law. Why? So that he would know it, so that he'd be able to actually enforce, instruct, and teach and exemplify what was expected of God's people as God's representative when they would have a king. Understand as well, from the time of the writing of the book of Deuteronomy, it was a whole 400 years of history before Israel had their first king. So these instructions were pretty, well, worth living up to as far as the hype that went behind them was concerned. And yet, of the three things, there's a lot of things that you were to do, but the three things you weren't to do, Solomon did every one of them in bulk. What were the three things that he wasn't supposed to do? Deuteronomy 17, verses 16 through 17. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Remember, this was written during the time of Moses. They had good reason and fresh knowledge as to why going to Egypt was a bad idea. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself. God's definition of marriage is one man, one woman, one lifetime. Anything beyond that is not God's plan, therefore settling for less than his best. Lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Well, you only have to read the first 3 to 5 verses of 1 Kings chapter 11 to find out he didn't keep those commands. Solomon, as far as accumulating horses for himself, if you know the famous archaeological site, Solomon's Stables, for a structure to last 3,000 years is one thing in of itself, but if you visit the nation of Israel and you see Solomon's Stables, you not only find out that it was an archaeological marvel, but you're also going to find out there's room for more than one horse in here. Someone's not doing addition, we got some multiplication going on here. And in fact, one of the things that he bragged historically of was his most prized possession, the mare from Pharaoh's army. Because understand the difference. All of the war horses in battle, they would be stallions. They'd be male horses. But the king, he would stand out. You know, you got the black, you got the brown, you got the gray and rusty old male horses in the battlements, the war horses, right? But then you'd look among the battlements of the army, and you'd see one white female horse, a mare, and she would be the one that the king would ride upon. Well, Solomon said, I got this mare from Pharaoh's collection. Wasn't there something in the Bible about not associating yourself with Egypt, specifically in the category of horses? Likewise, trust me, it gets worse. Solomon's yearly income, his net worth, was 666 talents of gold per year. It might be a reference to something. But nonetheless, a talent, for those of you who don't know, it's the most that you could be expected a human being to carry. And these guys were farmers, so they could carry a lot. This would amount to 110 pounds in modern measurement. And if that's a pure brick of gold, that would be in the billions of dollars we're talking about here. And then likewise, wives. Solomon, he married one wife as God intended. Add 3 more zeros after that, and we've gotten this number of matrimonial ceremonies. Oh, and by the way, all but one of them were not Christian, quote unquote. They didn't have a relationship with God. His first wife did, that's for sure. But the majority of them, the overwhelming majority of them, came from pagan nations that didn't have a relationship with God. And granted, we understand why Solomon did it, but he didn't have to do it. He was given the ability by God to be persuasive in his art of communication, but he still chose to do things their way. And so the way that other cultures would ensure that you wouldn't invade each other is you'd exchange daughters. And that way, they're a part of your family. Why would you go to war with a family member? I mean, Romeo and Juliet, of course, was that common illustration and exception. I guess they underestimated just how heated Thanksgiving dinners could get. But nonetheless, that's beside the point. Solomon married so many people who wanted nothing to do with the true and living God that they even nagged him into building temples to their pagan gods, who, by the way, most of them you would worship through either cutting yourself, demanding that in order for your kids to be considered grown-ups, you'd make them prostitutes, or if you had a child, your firstborn child specifically, You would dedicate your home by setting it the moment it was born, its head on the first brick of your home and smashing it with the second. Or even better, dropping the newborn infant on top of a brass oven heated up to be red hot. So definitely turned his heart away from God in that regard. Your relationships matter, let's just say that. But then Solomon, after looking into wisdom, he understood, look, no matter how much I know I should do, I don't do it. Passion trumps logic, so why not live for it? Passion, live for pleasure. No matter what I feel, I will indulge in. And he said that for himself. I did not withhold anything from myself that I wanted. And you know what conclusion he came to? No matter how good you feel, it never lasts long enough, nor ever is enough. Now, how could Solomon know that? Understand this. Name the drink, he drank it. Name the body type, he married it. Name the experience, he had it. Anything and everything as to what a human being could possibly desire in this life as a principle. Oh, well, he didn't have console games. Well, he didn't have a space travel or something. You understand the point that's being made here, though, right? When we're talking about a guy who literally had access to all the resources of his time and day, the one thing that came to his mind is the same thing that we all make when making a Steam purchase or when purchasing something that we like at the store. We always wonder, well, what's next? What else can I get? And that's always where his mind went to. It was never enough. He couldn't occupy his attention enough, just like all of his feelings. And they passed as quickly as they showed up, because that's how they work. He wanted to live for them, but he found out the hard way that hedonism, living for pleasure, isn't worth living for. So if that was the case, then if money and power and what they give me aren't enough, well, maybe the very concept that whatever I want, I could get. Well, what if money, wealth, what if the power to do these things is a satisfactory life in and of itself? Well, Solomon, as we stated before, he had more money than he knew what to do with, but no matter how smart he was with money, or no matter how much of it he had, he wasn't taking a cent of it to the grave. As Greg Laurie in Harvest Church is oftentimes quoted as saying, you never see a hearse, a little funeral procession, pulling a U-Haul. You ask the guy, how much did your father leave behind when he died? The guy would answer accurately, everything. Because you don't take a cent of it with you. To the dust we were taken, to the dust we shall return. Quoting Job, by the way. And we're talking about all this, and understand that even if your wealth, and that's a big if, your wealth lasts your lifetime, there's even more a possibility that you will see the very thing, the very foundation, whether that's government or military might and force, the thing that gives rocks and pieces of paper value. If I reach into my wallet here, other pocket, I reach into my wallet here and I pull out a dollar bill, understand that this piece of paper is only worth as much as the government tells the rest of the world that it's worth that, let alone those in the country, what it's worth. And the moment that that authority is no longer recognized, and I have to transfer over to, say, euros or to yen or to shekels or whatever country I'm going to, it ultimately is worthless there because they only recognize the authority of the United States in certain places. And the moment the United States government, the moment the United States economy crashes, their authority is moot. Because this ultimately is what? A piece of paper. A piece of paper that's given value by the government, but how long is that authority going to last? None of us know. The people living in the Great Depression, they didn't know that everything that they had accumulated in the Roaring '20s would come crashing down around them. That's why most of them committed suicide. The poor people were used to living in that kind of life, and they just adjusted. But understand the point that's being made here. Solomon knew this better than anyone else as far as this vanity, this emptiness in accumulating wealth, because as is quoted in the book, riches, don't set your heart on them because they make themselves wings and fly away. Solomon's net worth, what was it again? In the billions. 666 talents of gold per year that he took in. But he also, no matter how much gold he had stored in his houses, no matter how much he melted down and just covered his walls with as a set in principle, he looked at his son Rehoboam, who would inherit every last cent of it, and saw that he was a spoiled party animal. This dumb kid is going to spend it within a year of my death at best. So what's the point of gathering all of this? It wasn't something worth living for. You understand the point that's being made. So if money doesn't give me purpose, if pleasure doesn't give me purpose, if achievement doesn't give me purpose, if this guy ultimately isn't given purpose by living for himself, well, why don't I focus on making the lives of others better? If I focus on justice as a lawmaker. But you know what was interesting about that? He understood and found out the hard way that even the best men ultimately still act like animals. The good people become bad over time, and the jobs intended for good people somehow always end up being occupied by the worst kinds of people. And even if you have a good leader, evil people will either eventually kill him or replace him. The bad guys always seem to have the upper hand in this world. Now, how did Solomon know this? He was one of those good leaders, and he had seen firsthand how thankless, how dangerous, and how hopeless it was to do the right thing in, catch this, a world gone wrong. It's not to say that the desire for justice is a wrong one, but in a world where our default is to go against the very things that give us the ultimate purpose, pleasure, and satisfaction. It was said that it was the mass accumulation of self-centered rather than God-centered acts are ultimately what are destroying this world. And we need to understand that. If we're going to make any sort of impact, it needs to be an individual effort because you can't control other people's actions. And Solomon said, well, my job as a lawmaker is to encourage good and restrain evil. But it always seems that evil is either fulfilling the role of the restrainer, therefore letting evil run loose, and restraining good, doing the opposite of what that's intended, or it's only going to last as long as the good person is capable of, who's always being targeted, who's always being undermined, who's always being just spewed venom at whenever he tries to do the right thing. And that should be the case. We live in a world fallen, separate from God. So when we're talking about all this, Solomon's like, look, investing in the lives of other people, it's pointless because either they don't care or they just don't get it. Or even better, they don't want it. They want to live in a world fraught with chaos. So he says, I may as well focus on working on my own character. I'm gonna work hard. Hard work is what I'll live for. But what's interesting about that is that even the most talented of people oftentimes never seem to get anywhere in life. For those of you who've seen Netflix, which is generally everybody, if you've seen the documentary on the band The Eagles, one of the members pointed out that there were more talented musicians, more talented people in general as a rule than them, that they will ever be. And yet they never made a living doing their music, doing their art, doing fill in the blank. You know why? Because fame and fortune wasn't a matter of talent. He said, we were just at the right place at the right time. Now, how did Solomon know this? If the Eagles guy could get it, Solomon probably could, but how did he find that out? Well, understand, Solomon worked harder than anyone else and tried both doing it for himself and everyone else. When he did it alone, he couldn't enjoy it. When he did it for everyone else, they never appreciated it. And as much as he wanted them to, he understood there is a value in personal relationships because if you live for popularity, you try to make other people's lives better, or if you try to make your own life better, it's just going to lead you down the same dead end. It's never going to be enough. Now there's something there, but is there everything there? That's Solomon's dilemma. And that's what ultimately brings him back to the last point. Life. It ends with death. In this world. How did Solomon know? Well, Solomon was a lot of things. He was rich, he was powerful, he was smart, and he was human. He was made in the image and likeness of God, but fallen, and living in a world that was in the same state as he was. It was once perfect, but now stands as a glorious ruin of what God originally called very good. Understand, pleasure, power, peace, purpose, these things never satisfy because they weren't what we were created for. They're all simply extensions of their source. And that's a source that we all hunger for. And if we hunger for something infinite, understand that means that there's an answer to that need. As the famous author and thinker, teacher at Cambridge, and plenty other titles that I could hoist upon him, C.S. Lewis is once quoted as saying in his book, Mere Christianity, "The Christian says creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy," the book of Ecclesiastes in a nutshell, right? "The most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but to only, catch this, arouse it. To suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on one hand, never to despise or to be unthankful for these earthly blessings. Catch that. Is there something wrong with pleasure? Is there something wrong with achievement? Is there something wrong with working hard and focusing on the lives of others or yourself? No. But they are not a means to the end. And on the other, never to mistake them for the something else. They are only a kind of copy, echo, or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life, to press on to that country and to help others do the same. Falls right in line with Solomon's quote in Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 11, doesn't it? He has made everything beautiful in his time, and he also has put eternity in their hearts. For those of you who don't know that source, allow me to introduce you. His name is Jesus Christ. And if you understand what he has done for you in history as not only a real person, but as God incarnate, who came to this world to give his physical life so that you would have a spiritual relationship with him forever, that you could be given eternal life, as he himself promised in John 17 and verse 3, that this is eternal life, that they may know you. Ultimately, understand that is the life worth living for, and it's from that life that everything else in life is given meaning. If you're tired of chasing your tail, here's the alternative. Live for the thing by which all other things were created and consist. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have sincere questions, ask them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, do so. But most importantly, if you know someone who perhaps is in one of these categories and can use the spoiler alert that these things ultimately don't satisfy, please share this study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time in listening to this study. Remember that Jesus loves you, and most importantly, remember, he wants you to live for far more than what we settle for in this world, because we were created for something better. We were created for something bigger. We were created for him.